All right, so those were the headlines. And ladies and gentlemen, our top story is essentially on an AI panel recommending AI governance guidelines report. This happened yesterday at a press conference that was called by the Ministry of Electronics and IT. The government could consider these recommendations while framing the draft guidelines. In fact, the panel includes India-specific risk classification and reporting system. There's an accountability framework as well that recognizes the existence and presence of multiple players who should be held accountable. Then it also provides for sectoral regulators to be brought in for risk mitigation. But let's take a look at what are the principles that are governing India's AI governance framework. Number one is infrastructure. Well, the government will be, of course, providing, and it is rolling out infrastructure for AI development in the country. And of course, over 38,000 GPUs are being made available. Government is also going to take care of capacity building. There's going to be policy and regulation around this sector. Risk mitigation, accountability has to be set. It has to be inclusive, given the fact that the government's focus on any kind of tech innovations that are happening in the country, they have to be inclusive. For instance, UPI. Then for any kind of AI innovation, it has to provide social benefits. There is a chapter in institutions as well. AI has to be fair and equitable. And of course, it has to be understandable by design. And ladies and gentlemen, we are playing that quote by the IT Secretary, Mr. S. Krishnan. He said that India's approach is to not lead with regulation, but with innovation. And the government will provide adequate time for due diligence by companies and by intermediaries. He also said that the government will rely on existing legislation to crack down on deep fakes, and added that reasonable reaction by the government of India, by the regulators, will be key, and these guidelines are essentially intended to be light touch. To understand what to make of these guidelines by that AI panel, I'm now joined by Kazim Rizvi. He is the founding director of the Dialogue. Thank you very much, Mr. Rizvi, for taking the time out and speaking to us here on ET Now. In fact, let me begin by asking you, how do you see those recommendations by that AI panel with respect to how India should be approaching as far as regulation of AI in the country is concerned?
Thank you, Sumita, for having me on the show. I think this is a very forward-looking report. It's a vision document by the government, and they're looking at AI governance principles. There are 7 core principles which the report talks about. It talks about 6 key areas of recommendations across the entire AI supply chain. It's a forward-looking document. It's innovation-friendly. It talks about a light touch regulation, and it talks about the fact that at this stage, India does not need an omnibus or an overarching AI regulation. Uh, Whereas currently, if you look at the sectoral regulations and the sectoral regulators and the role they are playing, is quite sufficient to deal with the challenges of AI. So I think the report is quite balanced. I think it's very pragmatic, and I'm glad that we have not gone the way the EU has, because EU has a very restrictive, overbroad regulation on AI, which is now causing challenges for their own businesses locally. And India, on the other hand, we boast of nearly 300 Gen AI startups. We are one of the largest markets globally when it comes to AI. We are also, in terms of the investments and the opportunities, India is one of the fastest growing markets out there. So the opportunities are huge when it comes to the use case of AI and the socio-economic impact AI technology can bring across multiple
Right,
sectors, be it
right.
healthcare, finance, infrastructure. So the report lays out the government's vision for AI. It talks about addressing harms, but it's not going overbroad with very prescriptive regulations. And I think it's a wait and watch scenario, and it sort of leaves the sort of options to the sector regulators to take cognizance of their own areas, specific areas, which I think is a very pragmatic approach taken by the government.
Right, right. Right, Kazim, but would you say that the government is interested in a more hands-off approach? And can that work for a country like India and the kind of diversity we have? And how does this approach, you spoke about EU, but how does this approach compare to other countries like the United States and China, for instance?
So India it's not a hands-off approach. If you look at US, for example, US, the federal government is taking a similar approach when it comes to regulation of AI. I think what we are seeing in India and the US, and even in China, I think, is the fact that they are letting the model developers explore and experiment and sort of come up with state-of-the-art models to serve the people in the respective jurisdictions, right? I think it's very clear that this technology is at a nascent stage right now. And if you look at the existing regulations in India, you have the Data Protection Act, you have the IT Act, you have the Competition Act. You also have sectoral regulators like the RBI. RBI has published its own report by their Free AI Committee. So India is not hands off on AI regulation. The approach is not mirroring the EU's approach. EU has a very centralized omnibus overarching approach to regulate AI, which is a more to bottom, top down approach. India's approach is sort of bringing in different regulators with subject matter expertise to deal with the application differently. For example, if you look at healthcare, or let's say you look at finance, these sectors and the sectoral regulators will deal with AI differently as opposed to, let's say, transportation, or as opposed to maybe even other economic sectors. So I think the fact is that if you look at how RBI is dealing with finance and AI, will be quite different from how
Right.
the AI will be dealt
Right.
in within the application healthcare applications. So there are going to
Okay.
be certain categories which may
Okay.
require more oversight. There may be certain categories which may not require that much oversight at
Okay.
this stage. So I think that flexible
Right.
approach is what the
Right.
report talks about. I think that's something which is a welcome step forward.
Right, but Kazim, when we talk about this fragmented multi-regulator approach, how does that play out in practice? And what are the risks of regulatory gaps or overlaps,
Yeah.
especially when you have, this sort of an approach?
So the decentralized approach which we are talking about, I think one good thing which the report talks about is setting up of the AIGG, which is your AI governance group, which basically is going to be an interagency body which will pull together different ministries within the government, right? That will be supported by TPEC, which is your Technology and Policy Expert Committee, which will have your experts across policy, technology, infrastructure, governance, etc. So there is definitely a point about fragmentation, but I think these two recommendations would go a long way in terms of building that whole of government approach to regulation, which the report also talks about, that you need a whole of government approach to dealing with the technology. And this is something which, we've also been talking
Okay.
about publicly, that you need a more sort of a stronger mechanism within the government to deal with some of these issues and some of these harms which keep occurring or which may occur
Right.
in the future. So I think that is what the government is going to look at.
Right.
And existing regulations, like for example, the IT Act. Now, IT Act is quite sufficient to deal with, for example, the problem of deep fakes, which we've been talking about, right? I mean, so that is something
Right.
separate which will be dealt by the
But
IT Act
Kazim, let me
itself.
let me interject you here. You say that, right? But let me interject you here, Kazim. You say that we have the IT Act, and that's essentially what the government's viewpoint is. Also, that it takes care of all the issues related to deep fakes, misinformation, etc. But you do see the technology is innovating at the speed of light. So, how does
Mhm.
a country like India, which is so diverse, which is so huge, ensure that law keeps pace with bad actors? Will that not need then a
No,
single dedicated law?
so yes, the technology is moving quite fast, and the report talks about accountability. The report talks about risk mitigation, incident reporting, which is something which it sort of focuses on. It talks about voluntary frameworks as well and soft law mechanisms. So it leaves that option and the door open for regulators eventually to come up with maybe regulations for specific use cases if we are able to figure out that there's a very strong theory of harm which has been established. Yes, right now, if you look at AI, I mean, there are issues around. There are multiple harms which can occur when it comes to AI, and of course, you talk about biases in the data sets, or you talk about potential misinformation which can happen, or you talk about deep fakes. So some of these issues are already being addressed by the current regulation, and I think what we need generally also is a more robust system where we are able to have regulatory impact assessment and see that, okay, Whether the current regulation is good enough to deal with the challenges in 2025, maybe yes, but will it be enough to deal with issues in 2028? That is a question which we need to keep asking ourselves. So you need a very strong monitoring mechanism which evaluates the current regulations to the harms. At this stage, if you ask, in today's day and age,
Okay.
there is no need for an omnibus regulation because the existing laws itself haven't been tested
Okay.
to their limit, right? So you
Right. So
only need new
for
regulations.
now is essentially what
Yeah,
you're
for
stating, that
now.
these laws are enough, and then we'll have to see. The government will have to see.
Exactly.
Right. The
There
government will
has
have
to
to
be
see
a,
as and when the technology develops, and
yes,
then if there has to be a corresponding regulation or law,
exactly. So
even as this technology develops. But Kazim, let me also ask you, since the guidelines rely a lot on voluntary mechanisms and existing laws, is there a danger then of inadequate enforcement, especially for high-risk AI systems?
no, look, I think when we talk about high-risk AI systems, I think if you look at the current process of, for example, incident reporting with certain, or you look at voluntary frameworks, which the report talks about, or industry-led best practices, like model cards or public accountability reports, etc. So the report does touch upon these aspects. There is definitely a potential for relooking at some of these issues or relooking at some of these voluntary code of commitments, etc., going forward. But at the same time, if you look at industry, responsible AI practices have been spoken at length for many years. And the industry and the large industry companies and even companies which are focusing on building AI product must implement responsible AI practices even otherwise, right? Be it having robust cybersecurity safeguards, making sure that your data sets, there's minimal bias, the data sets are as diverse as possible. You have a very strong framework, responsibility framework embedded within the design of the AI system itself, right? So these terms are not new. And I believe that this will become a competitive advantage for AI companies in the future. The more you're able to demonstrate that you're implementing responsible AI practices, the more competitive you will become. And that is already a market incentive for companies to build their products in a way that it makes sure there is user safety, there is accountability, there is the design aspect is such that the system itself works in a way that it's protecting people who are using it and it's not harming them in a way that it could. At the same time, reporting mechanisms are very strongly established. Consumer grievance processes are very strongly established, right? So all of this is anyway necessary for AI companies, AI startups, right? I mean, the report talks about trust as a foundation. Now, you cannot build trust with people unless you
Right.
demonstrate that you're implementing responsible AI practices, right? So I think that's something which will
Absolutely. And
become a competitive
these,
advantage.
right.
Yeah. Human in the loop, for example, another
Right.
important
And these
principle, right? And
guidelines do very well. Right.
yes, the guidelines do a great job
Right.
of
And these
explaining and
guidelines do
giving an
demarcate
overview.
that point about accountability. Right. And these guidelines do talk about that point about accountability, given the fact that there are multiple stakeholders in the ecosystem and how accountability on each of them has been fixed. But definitely, Kazim will be looking forward to constituting of those draft guidelines as far as the overall AI ecosystem in the country is concerned, as far as its legal aspects is concerned. But thank you very much for taking the time out once again and speaking to us here on ET Now and decoding these guidelines.